This is actually the third talk I've given at a Judy Nicholson meeting, and the other two were excellent. This one has just kept with that. You will notice from my accent that I'm a Canadian, so I live near Toronto in Canada. I'm British by birth, so that makes me an immigrant and a Canadian. And I started a group called Kidney Cancer Canada about a dozen years ago, and really believe in the power of patients working together. And I sit as a founding member and board director of the International Kidney Cancer Coalition that brings all of this together around the world. So that's who I am. And as a stage 4 patient, I have to say it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be anywhere when you have stage 4 kidney cancer. So this is my conflict of interest statement. You heard the doctors say, oh, I take money from this company, and this company. I take zero money on a point of personal principle that I want to be able to maintain my voice. And I believe in transparency, that you should know that everything I do is as a volunteer. But my conflict of interest is actually trying to stay alive, and trying to stay alive with a decent quality of life. So I've listed here, now you all know how old I am. So I'm 59 years old. This was a picture taken about a dozen years ago when I was on a trial at the NIH, and I was learning a lot about American history thanks to many visits to Washington, D.C. But in the meantime, I've had a whole bunch of different interventions. I think I'm up to about 10 surgeries altogether. But it's been a very, very long journey. Diagnosed at age 14, metastatic since age 36. I thought I would be dead within a year. And lo and behold, I'm 59 years old and still going. So this is meant, not for you to follow what I've been doing, because none of this particularly makes sense for anyone else but my strange disease, but to give some hope that even when you think you're a goner, maybe you're not. And maybe you'll still have to start thinking about retirement now, which is a strange concept. So the clinical trials piece, what I'd like to do here is actually to start a bit of a revolution and to change the way we all think about clinical trials. And I wouldn't be saying this to you if I hadn't participated in trials myself. I'm not asking you to do something that I haven't done. So just with a quick show of hands, can I just get a sense of how many people here have actually been on a clinical trial? So you've got a good number of people here. You guys are our heroes, and I really think that you should be celebrated because you're moving the science forward. And ultimately, what my goal would be is for all of you here to be part of some kind of a clinical trial or a study, because the bottom line is that the status quo for kidney cancer, even with these new shiny treatments, is not good enough. So together, we can move this forward. So I'm absolutely passionate about this. The mantra that we have stolen from the HIV/AIDS community is nothing about us without us. So if there's a decision going on, whether it's at Congress, whether it's about a clinical trial, if there's not a patient advocate in the room, there should be. We just need more people speaking up for kidney cancer. So my goals today is I'm going to share with you a bit of patient experience from clinical trials and maybe a different way of thinking about your medical team. Might be disturbing for the doctors in the room, but that's okay. And talk about clinical trials and just thinking about asking about them all of the time. Can I join a study? What about this one? What about that one? Drive your doctor crazy with the clinical trials that you bring to them. And then beyond today, how do we make this better for everyone? Because there are some glitches. So the tip from the patient perspective, if I've learned one thing with 23 years of metastatic disease, is that your doctor doesn't know everything. No single doctor can. You're going to need a team around you. So think about who's on your personal team. So you have medical specialties, and I think of them a lot like technicians. So if you were building a house, you'd need a plumber, an electrician, and a roofer. And you wouldn't go and ask the electrician about your plumbing problem. So you're going to need all of these specialties, and you visit them, and sometimes you don't really like the electrician, and so you go see another one. But together, this team helps you keep the house standing. And that's how I think about the team around me. So I have really good surgeons and really good radiation oncs and some medical oncologists, but I make sure I visit them all fairly frequently and get their opinions, because there is this thing called specialty bias. Surgeons like to operate. It's what they do. So if you go and present your problem to them, they want to cut it out. I've discovered that. a great nurse, somebody to help you with the psychological impact of this disease, because that is absolutely huge. I'll mention a couple of times the big global survey that our international group did that said that 96% of patients have psychological burden with this disease, but only half of them are ever talking about it with their healthcare provider. So if you're not talking to your doctor, who are you talking with? I sometimes go visit my family doctor, but also through other peer-to-peer sometimes with other patients to say, you know what, I'm really struggling this month, and that's okay to say that and to get that support. But the most important person on this multidisciplinary team is you. So you have a role. Sometimes you're the only person who seems to be coordinating everything, but you really need to play an active role. And through the international group, we're actually producing some evidence now that activated, empowered patients live longer. We're going to have our own Kaplan-Meier curve that shows that it absolutely makes a survival difference in whether you are engaged versus being passive about your care. The other tip is about shared decision-making. Sometimes it's a myth. Our global survey found actually that 30% of patients, and we're talking about a big number, there were 2,000 patients, 30% of them said, my doctor decided for me. Those are powerful words. My doctor decided for me. And some of those patients were metastatic patients. So we know this is a serious disease, but to abdicate to your doctor and let your doctor make your treatment decisions, I think there's a bit of an issue there. So you want to be involved, you want to be as informed. And if it's just not your thing, then maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's a friend, somebody who would take this role and be your personal advocate. That would be really important. And just some tips here that I've put in red. You can practice introducing yourself to your physician to say, I'm the kind of patient who likes to be involved in my treatment decision. And if the doctor isn't okay with that, then maybe you're not going to be a good team. And I set out, these are my personal goals and expectations. And I've said quite openly now is I don't expect you to cure me. I don't want a surgeon to go in and remove everything in my abdomen. So don't think about curing me. Let's just deal with the disease as it's presented now and make sure that I have a good quality of life. Those are my goals. They might not be your goals. You might want to shoot for the cure, and that's fantastic. The other lesson learned is that you better get used to being an information broker. So you have the most interest in keeping track of everything about you. And if you think that all of your doctors are always talking to one another, they're not. And sometimes you get forgotten. So you need to make sure that Dr. A is talking to Dr. B and that you're keeping copies of everything. I heard in our patient session here, a couple of patients say, I'm not sure what type of kidney cancer I have. And that is the pivotal piece of information. That's what you need to start with. So when your doctor says, well, your pathology report came back, you say, can I have a copy of that, please? I've got your imaging results. Can I have a copy of that, please? So you become a bug in their ear that everything that they say that's about you, you get a copy. You can put them in a binder, keep them organized, but at some point, it gives you a sense of control, but it also has you in the center, keeping track of everything that's happened. In Canada, we have online patient portals, so I can sometimes download my results before my physician has seen them. That helps me because I can go in being prepared. Some other patients say they'd rather not know, and that's fine too. But if you have a patient portal, use that as well. And I would say that prepare for your appointment. That little graphic there is just a reminder that you don't want to be the deer caught in the headlights. That if you prepare for your appointment and say, I know I just had some scans recently. I have column A if the scans are stable and column B if the scans aren't stable, but you prepare for it. I would say that most of you, if you go visit a lawyer or a tax accountant, you probably prepare for that because they're pricey resources. So prepare for your appointment with your physician just the same way. So with regard to trials, I want to debunk this guinea pig idea that the patients who join clinical trials are just, kind of radical patients who like to be experimented upon. This is not true. We are all these patients, they're us. So I often hear patients say, well, I'll think about a trial after I've exhausted all of the other stuff, the stuff that's already been approved, the standard of care, as if that means something magical. And some people think that FDA approved is something magical. I could say that the FDA approved adjuvant sunitinib on not much data. So don't hold the FDA approval as being a very high bar. It's not. So think about the treatments that are FDA approved today. They were tested in clinical trials 8-10 years ago. So don't necessarily put the golden seal beside things that are necessarily approved. Patients genuinely fear placebos, extra tests, I'm going to have to go through a biopsy, and maybe being randomized for lack of choice. And I think that is why some of us as patient advocates have spoken up so much about the use of intravenous placebos in the trials, because it really knocked back people's confidence in trials. And in the US, of course, you can mimic trials off-label. So you can put drug A with drug B with drug C if your insurance will allow it. And now sometimes I appreciate there's a reason to do that if you can't get to a trial center, but you do that at your own peril. Because if that combination has not been tried, if you're not at a center where that trial is being run, you're genuinely taking your life in your hands. So we tend to think that the cancer will kill you, but the side effects will not. Well, drugs will kill you too if they're in a combination that's not being tested for safety. So there are other barriers that come into play, and I appreciate in the U.S. a financial barrier is one, location, convenience, but also your current physician might be your biggest barrier. So I'm not going to get into too much trouble because this is being webcast and archived, but just think about reasons why your current physician might not want to refer you for a clinical trial. Some of them might be financial reasons, and I hate to say that, but sometimes patients are kept too long with a current physician when there is a trial, but by the time they're referred over for a clinical trial, they've already exhausted too many lines of therapy. So that's perhaps a health system issue. So a data point here from our recent survey, when we ask people, have you ever had a trial discussed with you? 70% of the patients worldwide said, nobody's ever even discussed it with me. So 70%. And then we asked a further question. We said, if it was discussed with you, how likely would it be? And 89% of them said, yeah, I would probably join. So bear in mind, not all trials are drug trials. They're surgical trials, they're radiation trials, they're also observation studies. But we don't have a patient willingness problem. We have a patients being asked problem. So we're going to have to flip that around and do something about that. So we're not guinea pigs. So I would recommend to everybody here to ask early, is a clinical trial an option for me? And if your physician says, well, I'm not aware of one, well, that's a very real problem because there are many, many trials and your physician can't possibly know all of them. So connect with a patient group and we'll help you find trials. So even from the first sign that something might be cancer on your scan, there's a clinical trial that you could join and we could all learn from that. So look at the numbers here. With the first statement here says, we know it's in the literature that patients who are treated at centers with clinical trials survive longer. And that actually has no difference whether they're on the experimental arm or they're on the control arm. You survive longer if you're treated at a center that does trials. But look at this number, only 3% of cancer patients in the United States participate in cancer trials. So I don't understand that 3%. I would love for that 3% to be 10%, 15%, because then we would all get the answers that we need faster. We get to the answers much, much faster. And look at this sub-bullet here that says that less than 10% of your 3% come from racial or minority populations. That should be a huge flag to all of you, because the clinical trials, if we are recruiting white, middle-aged, well-educated Americans who live in major cancer centers, the results we have don't fully represent the American population. So we have a very real need to get minority populations onto clinical trials, and that's a movement. But I'd like you to think about trials as being an opportunity for you to leapfrog into the future. So getting on a trial means that you're going to have access to something that might not come before the FDA for another 5 years or so. You're going to get phenomenal, phenomenal care. In fact, the extra attention that you get on a clinical trial becomes bothersome sometimes, because every little thing that goes wrong, if you break a fingernail, they want to study it. So So you start to run out of things to talk about with your team because they're so very interested in your care. So it's phenomenal care. Patients who join studies, by and large, say it was a great experience. The other piece is the altruism, and I think some researchers think that all patients join trials because we're just really good people and we want to help other people. That's a piece of it, but I don't think it's the driving force. Most of us who join clinical trials are because we're trying to get treatment for ourselves, and an added benefit is that we get to help everyone else. So, but that certainly is a piece of it. But the falseness in thinking that I'll do that later, you in fact have more options for a clinical trial the earlier that you ask. So there's a phrase called the treatment naive patient, and it's physician speak, because patients may not have had any treatments, but they're never naive. We're not naive. So from a patient perspective, you all know that finding a trial, if we sent you all off now to laptops to say find a trial that you could sign up for, it's very, very difficult to find. I did a quick look. There are over 250 studies ongoing recruiting right now for RCC in the USA. And to Dr. Porto's point, if you looked in Brazil, there might be 9. There's just a huge number of clinical trials available to all of you in the USA, but it's hard to keep track of all of that. So do your own research, ask for help. The patient organizations will help you. So we talked about smart patients earlier on. There are lots of patients on trials on smart patients. The patient organizations will help you find a trial. I put a little flag in there to say, use some of the services, but beware of the company-specific trial finders, because they only want you to be on their trials. So if you went to a BMS site or a Merck site, etc., they're only going to list their studies, and that may not be the best option. But generally speaking, if you think about a periscope, and that's a reminder for me to say, whenever you've got an upcoming treatment decision to make, something's changing, you might have to shift off your therapy. If you think about putting the periscope up and looking around and seeing what there is. And if you're not in a position to do that personally, ask somebody to help you do that. So you say, I've already had 2 lines of therapy, I think I'm going to have to find a 3rd line, and then others will help you do a scan and see what trials there might be for you to join. But they are out there. So questions to ask. I won't go through all of these, but there are some clear, is there a placebo on the trial? Will I be randomized? What will the side effects be? And I would caution you that many physicians will talk about side effects that they're, quite tolerable, and this drug is fairly well managed. Then go online and ask patients what they've experienced, because sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between what a physician might say is well tolerated and patients who are spending all of their time in the toilet. So, do find that out. And just, I would say to you to protect your quality of life, because the trend right now with trials is for doublets and triplets of drugs. And there's a very real risk, I think, for quality of life. Maybe we'll get some great efficacy, that means effectiveness, but I think there's a risk to our quality of life. And I would always ask a doctor, well, why are you recommending this trial for me, and why now? Can I wait? Can I wait a month? Can I come back in 3 months? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes the trial is closing, such as one of the studies for papillary we heard, 97% accrued. If you were interested in that, you'd have to make a decision. So I'm going to get into the secret part, don't tell anybody, except this is being recorded. The statement is that not all clinical trials are created equal. So with my European colleagues, we have a phrase for these, and we call them stupid trials. These are trials that will not take us forward fast enough. So we have drug A and then followed by drug B. Well, let's do a trial to see if we started with drug B and then we went to drug A. So that's an interesting question, which one would be better? But it's not the kind of trial that is really going to cure more patients and help us live longer. So we put a very critical eye on clinical trials, and sometimes the trials that researchers think are very good ideas are not the ones that the patients think. The other secret here is that your participation is entirely voluntary, which means it's voluntary when you sign the informed consent, and it's voluntary every single day that you stay on that study. So let's just say you didn't like the way randomization worked out for you. you can pull out of that study at any point. The researchers would hate me for saying that, but you are always in control. And if the study is not working, if the number of visits is just too much for you, you can have the conversation, but you can withdraw. 3 weeks in, three years later, you can withdraw at any point. The other point is if you read about a trial, you think, oh, I couldn't do that because that's just way too many visits. You can negotiate some things. So not everything, but at some point I've been able to negotiate some of the imaging because I've had a lot of imaging. So you can ask about that. Don't discount the trial just because of something that's a problem. As I mentioned, the satisfaction is very high. And then a few controversial points here just to really stir things up. The researchers often believe that trials, they're randomized, they're double-blinded, nobody knows what you're on, and maybe that's true some of the time. But let's be honest, as patients, we are talking to one another all of the time. So if you have a patient out there on Checkmate 914, Ipi-Nivo versus IV placebo, that patient is reporting all kinds of side effects online, and the other patients are giving them all of the tips for dealing with immunotherapy. So yes, there is a placebo effect, and we need to be aware of that, but patients are not stupid. If it's a TKI versus an IO, we can figure that out. So in the age of the internet, sometimes physicians will say, don't go online, which is definitely not going to work. We're online anyway, we're talking to one another all of the time, and we're sharing our experiences. So we are figuring things out. Some patients will go as far as to go get a lab test, a blood test done, and try to figure out what they're on, because it's not in a patient's interest to stay on what they think is an inferior therapy. So maybe the world of clinical trials needs to catch up to where we are. And then making this all better for patients, this is really a backward system sometimes, where a trial gets designed and then it gets thrown out there, and then somebody will make a phone call and say, well, it's not recruiting patients very well. And we'll say, well, that's because it's a stupid trial. So the clinical trials need to be designed with patients involved right from the very beginning. And so that's what we do on the NCI Renal Task Force with my colleague Susan Petit and also Dina Battle, who these are names that you might have heard in the patient advocate community for kidney cancer. We look at trials all of the time. We don't always agree, which is a fabulous thing about passionate patient advocates, but we're all doing this with the sight of the patient in mind and making sure that patients are protected and that it's going to move us forward. So ideally we might have trials that would find the patients versus the other way around. So let's just imagine you have a rare RCC. We heard from a gentleman with translocation RCC or with a rare chromophobe, etc. The clinical trial should find that patient as soon as the pathology is read. There should be an alert coming up on the physician's screen, and to quote Meatloaf, it would say, stop right now. You're not going to go any further until you've talked to this patient about clinical trials, because patients' lives are being wasted going through therapies with these rare subtypes that are known not to be very effective. So let's get those patients on trials. In the trial design, I've already mentioned the intravenous placebo, and this is where I disagree with some of the speakers from this morning, but patients' interests have to come first. The Europeans with the Rampart clinical study have proven, this was the study in the UK, have proven that we didn't need to have all of those patients on intravenous placebo. So it's unfortunate that it went ahead. Those were industry-sponsored trials. The NCI study, the PROSPER, has no placebo involved, and that's because patients were involved from the get-go. So we need the crossover. I heard that from one of the speakers today. And some researchers will say, well, we can't allow crossover because then you contaminate the data. Well, guess what? We're not data points. We're patients, and we're trying to stay alive. So if in the randomization, there's a new phase 3 coming out that will be a HIF2 alpha that we're all really excited about, and the control arm will be everolimus, which is Afinitor. Some of us think that everolimus is perhaps not a particularly effective drug for clear cell RCC. So if you were faced with that kind of option of a hopeful drug versus a drug we don't have a whole, then at least offer the patient the opportunity to cross over. And if we need to go talk to FDA Oncology about interpreting that data, let's take that on. But let's not give patients inferior outcomes and then try to count the dead bodies at the end to see how many lived longer. So, oh, that was passionate. Okay, patient-reported outcomes. Those of you who've been on trials know that they give you questionnaires and you tick boxes every time you go into the clinic. We can do way better than that. So we need patient-relevant reported outcomes. Give us a device. We will tell you on our devices every single day how our diarrhea is. We would even take pictures if that's what you want. But we can give you way richer data than just ticking boxes on a questionnaire. So let's put those PRIs aside. Capturing patient preferences, all grade side effects, because it's not just the serious grade 3 side effects, but grade 2 diarrhea will also drive you insane. We need to get to a point, and this is particularly for the US, for there to be no financial burden in joining a clinical trial. You should not be financially penalized, because the way it is right now, we're only having people who can afford to be on a clinical trial. So trials and sponsors out there, the companies with the booths, they have a lot of money. They should cover the travel and the incidentals. And as I mentioned to those of you who put your hands up, the patients who join clinical trials are the heroes. They should be the heroes at ASCO and ESMO and every Congress. And sometimes I think the doctors who've been running the trial, that they think they are the heroes. So I just want to flip that paradigm and say, without the patients joining your trials, you wouldn't have a presentation. You wouldn't be on the stage. So let's make it easier for patients with real lives going on and jobs and kids and everything. Let's make it easier for them to get on study and stay on study, and let's give them the respect that they deserve. So here's a couple of trials. I like to, through the International Kidney Cancer Coalition, we like to make trials a little bit simpler to understand. This is the PROSPER RCC study. There's a 310 patients enrolled to date. It needs about 800 patients in order to bring this data in. But this study, so you can see the way this works. If you get green lighted, you're in one group or the other. The standard of care arm, the blue, they're going to go to surgery, and that's all that, and then they're going to be closely observed. And the others are going to have one infusion of nivolumab before the surgery and some afterwards. This study has the potential to change the outcomes for kidney cancer patients, to potentially prevent recurrence. And yet it's been a real struggle to find kidney cancer patients and intervene before they get taken to the OR. So why do they get taken to the OR so quickly? Some of it is the myth that kidney cancer is an emergency and you should be operated on next week. And that is very rarely the case. So even for newly diagnosed patients as they cross you online, do think about, there's a clinical trial opportunity for you here. And this is an excellent opportunity, open right across the US and now in Canada too. So Canada's pulling its weight on this study, I'm proud to say. This is another one of the studies that I think right now is recruiting and is really interested. This is called the Pedigree, PDI, Pedigree study. It's asking a really interesting question. So it says really, if Ipi/Nivo comes up front, then what do we do? What do we give our patients after Ipi/Nivo? And so you'd have to read this in detail. It's one of the more complicated studies that we've tried to simplify, but it basically says, well, what you do next depends upon how well the patient did. So if you didn't respond, then we're going to do some things differently. But this is a trial that offers patients 2 lines of therapy, and it answers a really important question because we've slotted Ipi/Nivo in the first line and we really don't have the data to support what we should do next. So this is the Pedigree study, and it's another study that patient advocates have been involved right the way through. So the takeaway points, there are some points from this rant, I promise you. One of them is to say, to think about a clinical trial at every point in the patient pathway. Don't think for a minute that that opportunity was long ago and you can't find a trial now. So from the earliest detection to later line, at least for an observational trial, we need to learn from every single one of you. So that's important. So for more options, potentially better outcomes, we all hope. So finding about a clinical trial, you may have to move outside of your local medical center. I realize a lot of you here are being treated at a big center. There are trials here, but great doctors will refer you out to another center where a trial is happening. So don't worry about that. You can go and have your trial experience, and hopefully that's a good experience, and then you can come back to your local center. But do think outside of the box and outside of your center. And my goodness, for the rare RCCs, you're going to have to go somewhere, because you don't want a local oncologist, a local urologist who doesn't have a good volume of rare RCC cases to be treating you. Don't let anybody tell you that this is just like ordinary kidney cancer. It's not. And so that's when you do actually have to go that extra mile to a good center. And I'm hoping that everybody, if we could get everybody engaged in trying to improve the outcomes and moving the profile up for kidney cancer, we really need more people on clinical trials. There are studies, and I know we're going to hear from one this afternoon, that they just languish for years and years because they can't find the patients to join the study, and that's a waste. That's a waste of precious resources. So how can we all champion clinical trials? I want to give you the inspiration from the UK here, that there was a focus that we need to up clinical trial enrollment. So they went from 1 in 26 cancer patients to 1 in 6. They quadrupled their enrollment in 10 years. Imagine if you did that in the United States with all of the studies you have open now. It could really bring new answers closer to us now. So this is Professor David Cameron, not the crazy prime minister who brought in Brexit. But it said it really shows the willingness of the people to participate in research that could potentially change the outcome of this disease. I can't say more that the treatments we have today are definitely a step forward, but we're not curing enough people, and we're not extending lives as long as we do. So let's get behind this. And I want to close with this quote from a patient advocate who just happens to be a physician, but we forgive him for that. His name is Mark Lewis, and he's quite prolific on Twitter, if you're on Twitter. So to coin his words here, I've learned this one undeniable truth: for all of the studied intellect of doctors and the incredible array of diagnostic testing by which they can refine their hypothesis, and here it's beautiful, there is no force in medicine more positive and powerful than the self-advocating patient. So you are the force that you need in your own care, and don't underestimate that for a minute. And with that, I say thank you. The beautiful leaves, etc., say that it's Canadian Thanksgiving this weekend, so happy Thanksgiving.